Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Pleased to meet you again. Session, and probably it should be the last week in this term, and I expect your good performance on the final exam. I just saw many students dispersing on reading materials and printouts. That is ambitious and also prospective to achieve good results. So I encourage you to make a effort to prepare for the exam and for the present summer vacation. So in this class, we'll discuss the rest of topics involving the executive and judicial and quasi-judicial organs of a socialist legal traditions. And I know that we missed some point about the legislative process in Soviet Union, so we'll got some more in make-up purpose, and then we proceed to the executive and dominantly concerning the judicial and quasi-judicial organs. So I have a brief comment about an introductory purpose. So you see some basic points about the judiciary in Soviet Union. Then we turn to review the regular course through various special context of a judicial system in Soviet Union. For example, what is a state arbiters? It means economic course. And as you see, the socialist system of nation sees a different framework about the state economy, the central planning and other kinds of a control by government into economic planning, and what is the case to enter the contract. We usually call it a plan contract. So there are scope of a special dealings exclusively on the disputes or issues arising from a plan contract, and actually it accounts for a major part of a state economy in the communist context. So the economic codes play a crucial role to each corresponding organs. For example, it may serve to a specific serve the specific state in geographic terms, or it may be assigned to respond to the needs of a department of federal government, and interdepartmental branch may also administer the economic court system to address the economic disputes. So you have a separate viewpoint between a plan contract and normal civil issues, for example, torts and other contract excluded from the category of a plan contract. And there are also many special commissions which could be viewed in strict sense as analogous to the classes of a liberal state, what we call governmental commissions. Various forms of government also practiced in France or in Republic of Korea and others. So it is kind of a institutional dimension to share, but you may find a similarity, points of similarities and also a dissimilarity, which should be notable since it is a communist legal system. So what is foreign trade arbitration, for example? We also manages this kind of institution in Korea and other contexts. And also you can see, for example, International Trade Commission in United States, and also what the Department of Commerce is principally responsible to address the foreign trade affairs, and also some special code in federal level to respond to the disputes arising from a foreign trade disputes, a code of a international trade. You can see in the United States context. That is Article 3 code in the U.S. constitutional scheme. And you can find Article 1 code, which you often call a legislative code, and may be properly juxtaposed to those scope of councils or independent commissions. And you can also find a Maritime Arbitration Commission, the party arbitration. The arbitration is a popular term you can encounter through the discourse, since that is one a dominant institution favored by court, and they see the nature of a civil dispute in light of a arbitration, and also their concept is relatively flexible, which is one cause to vitiate the judicial in strict sense as developed by liberal states. So we see the judicial branches as least dangerous branches in Soviet Union, also across the socialist states, and their perception is generally powerful over involving what they call a bourgeois myth. So their perception is strong, as I mentioned, centering on political and economic centralization, and the ideology is absolute, which leads us to many special arrangements. For example, prejudice of courts in various ranks of court, and forms of in diversity over jurisdiction and across the areas or regions. So generally they consider the court to be responsible to the collegial body. Actually, what is that? The parliament of a Russian Federation, a Soviet Union, People's Congress of China. So it is politically responsible, and they are elected and also removable by a legislative body, the judges, and you can see later lay persons who are eligible to sit to administer justice in Soviet case. All scope of a judicial personnel are responsible to the legislative body, and that is also the case for the executive. So the executive body in communist states, as we see in the previous Soviet context, is also responsible and recallable by literature. Practically, it is more powerful, and extent of a role and their performance is greater than literature in normal context. But in institutional viewpoint, the hierarchy goes in that way. But what? Actually, the executive branch is weaker, but in real dynamism, it is more powerful, and also just second only to the permanent organs of a People's Republic of Congress, a standing committee. What is that? Presidium, as we have learned in the Soviet case, former Russian Federation, former form, now reshuffled by Russian Federation, as I introduced. And we also tasked with to understand 6 general principles of Soviet code organization, and in due course for this class purpose, we expect to review Soviet judicial styles, and the point is very characteristic to determine the status of a legal family. So it is one of the factors which should be a major in many contexts. How we class its judicial style in comparison with other legal families. The Soviet judicial style is different from typical civil law countries such as France, or a typical common law country such as England and the United States. It is much closer, however, to the French judicial style than it is to the common law style. So you can see in the court opinion some preordained steps to start beginning with a brief statement of facts of the case and brief history of the case, tracing the progression of the case through the courts below, and statement of legal reason to sustain the decision and the decision of the court. And in a section about general principles, it is interesting and may enable us to share some points, which should be in twofold. For example, judicial independence is also cherished in Soviet authority. Of course, as I've said, bourgeois myth is one of a concept they saw the judiciary. So very skeptical of their independence in a fundamental disposition. However, despite that understanding, they favor to ensure the independence of judiciary. So that means some within some fundamental classification, they promote the theme to ensure effective administration of justice and the social legality. So both two concepts, social legality and judicial independence, may corroborate, notwithstanding the political ideology or its dominance, to share for the judicial culture and Western concept of law and principles. So they actually arrange a special proceedings, or in some extreme cases, you can see a special a statute exclusively prepared to deal with the misconduct of judges or others. In that light, you can see a heightened heightened extent of a judicial independence in Soviet Russia. So it actually was interwoven, and the specific point of focus varies to address the historical weight and lessons, or the political reality and other basic compassion of society. So very delicate and also inviolable in many senses for its intricacies and autonomous preserve to survive. So as I've said, it recurs and also feels through the circumstances and challenges. So institutionalist and legal evolutionist, and also a comparativist in our purpose, may see such a some of ingenious preserve for our understanding. So how do you assess? So that is a point. And but about the principles, you also identify a previous commandment about many. So, for example, the appointment ways of to create a judicial post is dominantly based on an election, for example, and responsible to collegial body. And through the course, you can find some interesting points in comparison. For example, plenum. What is plenum? So actually, it could be kind of a center and a crucial necessary to as a conduit, inculcated by a communist leaders, for example, Communist Party and others. So that is a distinct aspect we could not normally identify in the liberalist arrangement of judiciary. So independence of judiciary in that sense may be vitiated for your intelligence. But there is one factor to interplay and to be considered in a comparative purpose. So we expect to review in a brief two cases to expose you the judicial style of a previous Soviet Union. But I'm afraid we should miss to lead you other areas of a special course. It contains a general description for your class purpose. I'm not sure, but if all could be settled, then we may return to two cases. So in the previous class, you will note some distinctive process that is unusual in the liberal scheme of legislative process. For example, amendment to the proposed legislation may be introduced by individual deputies either orally or in writing. If the amendment was presented in a written form, it must be disclosed to the other deputies by the chairman of the chamber. It deemed necessary that the deputy who proposed the amendment may be called upon at his request to back up his amendment on the floor of the House. All proposed amendments are placed before the House for a vote. Alternatively, the Supreme Soviet or its chamber may decide to forward the proposed amendment to its committee for further study and recommendation to the general meeting of the chamber. Upon receipt of the recommendation of the committee on the proposed amendment, the chamber votes. All listed proposals or comments thereupon, with the exception of amendments to draft legislation, which were presented on the floor of chamber by deputies, as well as conclusion reached by the standing committees on the listed proposal, are forwarded by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet to the proper state organs or non-governmental organizations for their study. So, except for a Communist Party, the Presidium of Supreme Soviet is actually a top institution to administer all scope of state affairs. You can find this word through the executive and also each branches of a code, and so that is actually a prestigious to forge the communist ideas, so considered an actual authority in the scale scope of a arrangement. So for example, they are empowered to render a guiding principles of interpretations. So the judges in normal court have no power to create no power of lawmaking. Usually that differs from the common law judges, and also may be distinguishable from a civil law judges, since civil law judges may be bound by the statute terms and prescriptions, but actually they have a scope of a plenary power to interpret the provisions and articles of statute unabridged in practical context. Of course, miscarriage of justice may be safeguarded by a appellate review and integrated in the unitary governance of a Supreme Court. But actually, no practical influence or any binding context of authority are not discernible for the civil law cases also. So it is orthodox in socialist legal tradition that the presidium even make a written and also authoritative dictate about how to interpret this statute or others. And the other socialists may be found in lay persons. They should differ from jury trial system in United States. May be similar in limited context, but might get closer to the majestic court practice of United Kingdom. But there are points of difference, of course, since they also served communist ideas and influenced by the authority actually instituted in the form of a presidium, various contexts. And you note in other contexts particularly concerning the administration of a state, and what a Soviet Union formerly and also Russian Federation, a federal union concept, what we call a union republic. So that means, in proper comparison and very analogous to various states in the United States. So it represents the interest of various states in Russia and Soviet Union. So you can imagine a federal system in the United States which comes in analogous fashion, not dominantly but very closely. There are also some distinct points you have need to mind. For example, the Union republics may have representation in a Soviet Supreme Court by way of a plenum, which is a political process and required to maintain uniformity of a entire Soviet Russia. So they have share in federal Supreme Court in Russia. That is not the case in United system. So so we have some different leverage to see the dynamism of a federal system, as you see. With these bodies, presidium, must in turn inform the presidium of any discussion of proposals and measures taken relating to them. So the chambers and also the intra-parliamentary organs interact. The text of the proposed legislation, which is to be discussed previously, as well as the conclusion of Standing Committee of Supreme Soviet on those draft legislation, shall be made available to the deputies sufficiently in advance to give them enough time to think about it. The minimum time period during which deputies must receive a text of proposed legislation is not stated. In fact, Article 57 of the rules further provides that if a draft legislation that does not have a general normative character was not handed to the deputies, it shall be read out just before the vote on it. Depending on how the chamber wishes to proceed, the chamber may elect to vote on the entire legislation, or to start with a separate vote on each article, then on each chapter, to be followed by a vote on each section, and finally on the entire legislation. So, actually you can find some leadership in the liberal context as analogous. So, a strategic perspective reveals its dynamism, which is also institutional. So, the confidential nature of legislation is actually strong in your sense. Pursuant to the provision of Article 114 of the USSR Constitution and Article 48 of the Rules of the USSR Supreme Soviet, a law of the USSR is deemed adopted only if it received the favorable vote of the majority of the membership of each of two chambers of Supreme Soviet. By contrast, any law that seeks to amend the Constitution of the USSR is deemed adopted only if receives the favorable vote of at least 2/3 of general membership of each chamber of the Supreme Soviet. So, Postan Novely and other acts of the USSR Supreme Soviet are adopted by simple majority vote of total membership. The clear implication of the provision of Article 48 of the rules is that there are 3 different votes that are required for the adoption of acts of Supreme Soviet. For acts that seek to amend the Constitution, a two-thirds majority vote in each of two chambers of Supreme Soviet. For organic statutes, a simple majority vote in each of two chambers of Supreme Soviet. For all other acts, a simple majority vote of total membership of Supreme Soviet. This latter vote does not necessarily require a majority vote in both chambers of Supreme Soviet. So, Soviet Russia actually engineered a parliament system, and they so the state power is centralized into one parliament, as we said, and Presidium has a notable standing to lead the collegial body. So it has the authority to amend the Constitution. So all state powers in final event to report to in a managing and governing purpose to a collegial body of a Congress. So at the discretion of Supreme Soviet, major questions may be submitted to national referendum. The decision to submit an issue to nationwide referendum, as well as the specific issues that will be placed before the people in such a referendum, are made by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR by simple majority vote of its total membership. So it is a written practice on national referendum. It differs from the United Kingdom, I suppose, and also many institutions now incorporate a national referendum as one of a constitutional device to dispose the crucial and important national policy agendas. For example, you can also conform in the Korean context about the articles and provisions pertinent to national referendum, A72, and two ways of national referendum now instituted, which can be viewed in some sense emergency power and kind of prerogative, as we have learned in United Kingdom, to administer the nation in fundamental justice and needs. Pursuant to Article 115 of the USS Constitution and Article 50 of the Rules of the USSR Supreme Soviet, if there is a disagreement between the two chambers of Supreme Soviet on any draft legislation, the matter must be submitted to joint conciliation committee of both chambers. Each chamber has to have a equal representation on such committee. After the committee has discussed the matter, it is resubmitted to joint session of two chambers for a decision. If the disagreement between the chambers persists, the matter is held over for the next session of Supreme Soviet or submitted to a nationwide referendum. Article 63 of the Rules of the USSR Supreme Soviet stipulates that any law adopted by the Supreme Soviet, including a decree issued by the Presidium, must be published within 7 days. Publication must be in the official language of the individual Union republics and must be signed by the chairman of the Presidium and secretary of the Presidium. Article 66 of the rules further stipulate that all new laws of the USSR shall be published in the Bulletin of the USSR Supreme Soviet, as well as the Soviet government newspaper, Ibetchila. By contrast, all decrees of Presidium that have general significance must be published in the Bulletin of the USSR Supreme Soviet. However, if such decrees need to be communicated widely and immediately to general public, they are additionally published in the newspaper Izvestia. So the publication is one of a legal instance, as you see in the Korean context, and might be affected across jurisdiction. Also, not exception for the Soviet Union. So the effect of statute may depend on the publication date for illustration, or other ways to determine may be provided in a pertinent statute that you see, and also for the judicial purpose, and particularly in the comparative perspective, we usually study a kind of a court report, the ways to publish and the concerned interest, or the context of responsible unit. It is important. As you see later, there are two separate laws actually to respond to the publication needs of a court opinion and judgment. Two pathways involving official context and also a private initiative, which is very flexible and may be varying with each private enterprise. So it is one of a notable point, distinguishable from other United States or a civil countries. Nothing prevents the USSR Supreme Soviet from bringing a new law to the attention of the general public by resorting to other media of mass information. A law of the USSR goes into force at the same time throughout territory of the USSR, 10 days after the date of its publication, unless by law a different waiting period is established. Typically, the Supreme Soviet extends the waiting period beyond 10 days from the date of publication of the new law. Nothing prevents it from establishing a shorter waiting period. For example, the 1977 Constitution of the USSR went into force on the date of its publication on October 7, 1977. Upon adoption, every law of the USSR is listed chronologically in the Register of the Acts of the USSR Supreme Soviet and the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Soviet. And you can see later some discussion about authority of a official registry. Is one tradition identified in selective Western states, for example, United States. Is it so? Or France is notable to keep the national record and registration. And the Soviet Union is also one of companion to ordain the kind of a national powers about registration, or we have less traditions on that streamline, for example, and as pointed out by one senior professor in Korea. So that is a weak point, and that weakness was once attempted to remedy by a former administration, Moon-no, and they have tried to enact the statute in that purpose. So we now have advanced standing about the context from the former decades. Then Now we begin to review the executive. Because all socialist countries operate a parliament system of government, all members of the executive department, with the exception of the ex officio cabinet members, must be members of the legislature. Typically, members of the executive branch are selected by, responsible to, and recallable by the legislature. Despite this theoretical subordination of the executive department to the legislature, the former is in reality more powerful than the legislature. In terms of real power, the executive department is second only to the permanent executive organ of the legislature within the system of a state organ. Membership of the executive department of government, however, often overlaps with that of the permanent executive organ of the legislature. So that is one characteristic we usually encounter in the parliamentary system of nation. So they have two posts simultaneously. They serve as a congressman and also responsible about executive power in department. Cabinet members may. That is in principle not desired by a presidential system, but also you can have a varied forms and ways of dealings across jurisdiction. Even in the presidential system of nation, then but you have a constitutional provision to permit a dual official title and services. Despite a membership of the executive department of government. The executive branch of socialist state goes by different designation in different countries. For example, in the USSR, it is called Council of Ministers. In Yugoslavia, the Federal Executive Council. In Albania, the government. In the People's Republic of China, the State Council. And in North Korea, the Cabinet. This is just a normal culture. So the constitutional status is virtually the same. And as I've said, some reforms could be charted around 1990s. So may have changed forms. Most of what you have to say here applies specifically to the Soviet Union, but it applies also mutus mutandis to all the other socialist systems. So it serves in some of modality for follow works in comparison. They may be totally dismantled, but also some point of lessons in comparative purpose. The official designation of Federal Executive Authority is Council of Ministers of the USSR, charged with executing and administering the laws of the USSR. The Council of Ministers is formed by joint session of the USSR Supreme Soviet. It consists of a chairman, constitutionally unlimited number of first vice chairmen, an ordinary vice chairman, ministers of the USSR, and the chairman of all the USSR state committees. The chairman of the Union Republic Councils of the Ministers are ex officio members of the USSR Council of Ministers. So Union republics should be understood in a comparison with a federal system of the United States. It represents various states, which not actually in a former Soviet Union there were a 15 states possessing autonomous power to administer a union republic. So it constitutes the federal system in partial in their share to interact and also decide presented national agenda, also other responsibilities. So they are ex-officio members of the USSR Council of Ministers. At the request of chairman of the latter council, heads of other federal agencies and state organizations may be appointed to the council by the USSR Supreme Soviet. Even though it is a creature of the Supreme Soviet, the tenure of council extends beyond that of the Supreme Soviet. Like the Presidium of Supreme Soviet, the Council of Ministers stays in office until a new Supreme Soviet is elected and convened. At that time, the outgoing ministers formally tendered their resignations in mass, allowing the Supreme Soviet to form a new Council of Ministers. Outgoing council members are eligible for reappointment. Once the ministers have taken office, the council forms its own presidium, consisting of the chairman of the council of ministers, who also serves as chairman of the presidium, the first vice chairman, and the vice chairman of the council of ministers. This inner working group functions as a permanent executive organ of the council. Under Article 130 of the USSR Constitution of 1977, the Council of Ministers is responsible and accountable of the Supreme Soviet or the Presidium. The Supreme Soviet may change the composition of the Council of Ministers anytime during the latter's 5-year term. The general authority of the USSR Council of Ministers is spelled out in Article 131. So it is a provision grounding the authority of executive in Soviet Union Council of Ministers. It is usually, as you see in the European context, a Council of Europe or empowerment system notable. According to this provision, all executive powers that are vested in the federal government by the Constitution and laws of the USSR accrue to the Council of Ministers to the extent that these powers have not been delegated to the Supreme Soviet or the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet by other limiting provisions. And also this name is now encased in WTO organizations. Council of Ministers is a supreme body of decision making in WTO, and they actually are responsible to liberalist scheme of a world economy, and also principally assign the responsibility to ensure a fair competition and a liberal scheme of economy and market. So we usually call the Council of Ministers in WTO as one of quasi-constitutional body to perform the monitoring and a quasi-judicial control about a state economies of various states. Of course, it is in theory of law limited to the member states, but you can see a fair number of it actually dominant number of nations in this world are member states of WTO. So we are now playing very organized governance about economic issues in the global scale. And one of notable organizations, very powerful, other than the international organization, many of other international organizations is popular and most organized fashion of a judiciary to ensure predictability and legal stability. Among some of general powers and responsibilities of the executive branch is the authority to provide overall guidance of the national economy and the program for the social and cultural development of Soviet society, formulate long-range policies for the development of science and technology and for the rational utilization and conservation of natural resources, administer the Soviet monetary and credit system, as well as wages and price policy, administer the uniform state statistical system, formulate and submit to the Supreme Soviet both short-range and long-range plans for the economic and social development of the USSR, implement measures designed to safeguard state security, the conduct Soviet foreign relations. So the scope power enumerated on on these pages, you can see very similarities to the counterparts of liberal state. But how do you see many divisions dealing with economic national economy in very it's just not activist, it actually controlling power to administer the national economy. So that is the point, distinguishable. But how do you see the change in the recent political transformation? And one hurdles which travels the membership of a Soviet Union and many communist countries of decades. Of course, we have a special provision to respond to the Soviet communist performance in the global market, but that could be difficult to establish fine match. So in case it is fairly welcomed to have new membership from Russia recent years, and also China before the entrance of Russia a couple of years earlier. So, among the special powers of federal executive in the area of foreign affairs is the authority to oversee the fulfillment of a Soviet treaty of obligations within the USSR, and to ratify or denounce intergovernmental agreements without the advice and consent of the Presidium. And also interesting to see the words overall guidance of national a program for the social and cultural development of Soviet society. So how do you perceive this authority expected to exercise by a council of ministers and executive powers in Soviet Union? It is interesting for the state to intervene in this sector of society, However, this is not the case in United States, which is the original form of a liberal constitution state. But this command was cherished in Korean Constitution. So we have now updated version of Constitution, very civilized and advanced, and also on a progressive stance. In the exercise of executive authority, the Council of Ministers issues implementing orders and regulations. Like all other federal acts, its orders and regulations have the force of law throughout the USSR. In theory, this means that if the Constitution, a statute, or regulations of Union Republic are inconsistent with an order or regulation promulgated by the Council of Ministers, the former must yield. The interpretation of Article 133 is consistent with the general spirit of Federal Supremacy clauses of the Constitution. So we have some points in separation and also comparison, which is close on one hand, but differs on the other hand. Actually, federal supremacy, a common concept to share between Soviet Union and United States, but for example, the extent of engagement is ensured in secure scope of institutions and performance, but they actually go same to defeat the state interest in most of cases. That is the case we can identify in the Federal Supremacy Clause, United States. So the Constitution envisaged a crucial scheme about its extent of power as enumerated in the Constitution. So the federal authority actually expects to have commitment on enumerated powers. That is practically implausible to address the needs of a federal government and society. So it expands actually, but in theory and a principle, it is limited to the powers conferred expressly, and the necessary and proper clause is key a provision in conduit to expand the federal power, and also dominant source may be resorted to commerce clause. So commerce is one of a very popular tunnel to mine the federal powers in the context. In any case, the Soviet Union goes in the same largely and has federal supreme court. Given the limited context of scope power, the hierarchy is prescribed to ensure against the state powers. That is the case in United States and also in Soviet Union. So the USS Council of Ministers is specifically granted the authority to suspend the execution of an order of Council of Ministers of Union Republic if the latter is consistent with an order of the USSR Council. So actually, there is no authority, particularly legislative authority, to quell the contrary commandment from a Union Republic or a state government in United States, in Soviet, the Union Republics, for example. But you can see the role of Council of Ministers to directly invalidate the laws of each state in Soviet Union also. That is not the case in the United States. Of course, Seoul unique that should not be unique, but dominant fashion of dealings may found in the judiciary of the United States. So the Supreme Court may annul the state laws, and actually they have authority to strike down the federal laws also repugnant to the federal constitution. So there is also hierarchy in the letter of varying forms of a federal statute or decree or a presidential orders, and also the context may diverge involving a federal system. Finally, USSR ministries are classified into two groups, all Union and Union Republic. Unlike the 1936 Constitution, however, the 1977 Constitution makes no attempt to specify which ministries belong to each group. Each USSR ministry is responsible for the administration of state policy in one area or group of related areas. To ensure uniformity in the operation of the individual ministries, the Council of Ministers coordinates their work. The PRC Constitution of 1982 similarly regulates the status of State Council of the People's Republic of China. It is the executive organ of the highest organ of state power, as well as the highest organ of state administration. The term of office of State Council is the same as that of a National People's Council. The Premier, the Vice Premiers, and the State Councillors are limited to 2 consecutive terms. The Premier directs the work of State Council. The State Council has authority to draw up and implement the plan for the national economic and social development, as well as the state budget, direct and administer the construction of national defense, conduct foreign affairs, and conclude treaties and agreements with foreign states, and so forth. It must provide a periodic report of its work to the National People's Congress, or when the latter is not in session, to its standing committee. And another important constituent element of the executive branch of the Chinese Socialist government is the Central Military Commission, which is charged with directing the armed forces of the whole country. This body is responsible directly to the MPC, or when the latter is not in session, to its standing committee. So now we close the brief overview of the executive and turn to next topic. What is that? Judicial and quasi-judicial organs. So this is the 4th session, closed, and we expect to see in the next session. Thank you for your attention.